I launched myself on this campaign of bad-mouthing every actor in Hollywood in order to get this part. And I would walk by Steven's office and say things like, Al Pacino has no sense of humor, or Jack Nicholson's crazy, or whatever I had to say. I didn't care. And on the day that I said to him, "You need a child. That's what you need for this part," he looked up and he said, "You got the part."
At the time of pre-production, the team behind Close Encounters was constantly on the verge of having the film pulled. Columbia was nervous about shelling out $5.4 million for Steven's film, and their biggest advocate was David Begelman. Joe Alves was the first person hired for the film, as we previously mentioned in our last video, and Alves noted that studio bigwigs and bankers often visited the soundstage to inspect his work. The studio had a lot of faith in the film, but the money was always an issue. As more crew was hired and new perspectives were added into the mix, the studio realized that the film would cost more, and we will touch on that in just a second. To add to this, Steven's dynamic duo of producers were going through a divorce as well, and since tensions were high between them, it was decided that Michael would mainly manage Taxi Driver, while she focused on Close Encounters of the Third Kind. Other key people were in place for the production early, such as Verna Fields, who brilliantly edited Jaws. John Williams was already spoken to about the idea of the aliens communicating with music, and ideas were already entertained by the director and composer. There were two things that really caused the budget to rise dramatically. The first was the location for the alien contact base on the dark side of the mountain. They needed a big stage, and they searched many places for one that could fit what they were looking for. They found their set in the form of an old Air Force base in Mobile, Alabama, that was run down, and it was perfect because they could open the runway doors to make it appear larger. From this, they found homes in Alabama that could serve as a community where the main character and his family could live. This meant that the shooting would take place in Alabama rather than California, and the budget jumped from $5.4 million to $7 million, and then $9 million. This caused the studio to sweat, but the budget rise wasn't over yet. The second big expense came when the effects team was hired, and the key person asked to manage it was Douglas Trumbull from 2001 fame. He told Julia Phillips up front that it would cost $3 million to achieve the shots needed for the film, and she was floored by that statement. She, in turn, asked Doug how much he would need just to start up. He replied $1 million. This was the moment Julia made a tactical decision. Believing in the film, she made sure Doug had 1/3 of what he needed up front, and then refrained from telling Columbia that the effects would cost $3 million. She figured if the movie got started, the studio would pay the other $2 million once they saw what they had, and the film was deep into production. She feared that if she added another $3 million to the budget, Columbia would shut the picture down, and she was probably right. In Julia Phillips' autobiography, You'll Never Eat Lunch in This Town Again, she admitted that she deceived the studio about the expense, but if she hadn't, the film wouldn't have been made. By the time Trumbull's $1 million expense was added to the film, it was now at $11 million. The board at Columbia wanted to shut down the movie, and Columbia was on the verge of bankruptcy. Even healthy studios would consider $11 million a crazy risk. The only real ally Close Encounters had was studio head David Begelman, who had faith not only in the producers and Spielberg, but the project as well. So Begelman did the only thing he could. He put his job on the line and vouched for the expenses. He stated the film would definitely clear $80 million if they stayed true to the project, which was a tall order, and you must remember that in 1974, $10 million was enough for 3 films, and Close Encounters' budget already passed that marker. Finally, on February 1976, Begelman was told by Columbia that Close Encounters could have $11.5 million budget, and Begelman knew if the film was not successful, he would be fired. It was the highest budget picture in Columbia's 50-year history, and filming was to begin on May 17, 1976. Close Encounters was officially given a green light. Casting officially begun before the green light. Steven started this process before Jaws wrapped, and Richard Dreyfuss was there for it all. He had already met the producers and earlier writer John Hill, and Richard heard everything about the film and who Steven Spielberg was considering. Steve McQueen was spoken to about playing the lead, and the two met in a bar where McQueen said he couldn't do the part because he couldn't cry on camera.
And I said, okay, I'll cut out the crying. I'll cut out the crying part. He said, no. He said, the crying broke my heart. The crying actually almost made me cry reading the script. But he said, but once that camera's rolling, I don't think I'm going to be able to deliver the goods to you. And I respectfully have to, say I can't do it. And it broke my heart.
Al Pacino, Jack Nicholson, Robert Duvall, Dustin Hoffman, James Caan, and Gene Hackman were all considered for the lead role. But after a bit, Richard realized the character needed to be an everyman, and Steven understood that too. When the character changed from a Blue Book agent to a normal man, Richard knew he wanted the part and lobbied for it. He then began pestering Steven by saying that no one was right for the part except him, until finally one day, Richard stated,
"And on the day that I said to him, 'You need a child. That's what you need for this part,' he looked up and he said, 'You got the part.'"
On February 5th, 1976, Columbia officially announced the movie's production to the media, and it did not come without some backlash. Dr. J. Allen Hynek's lawyer stated that the term Close Encounters of the Third Kind belonged officially to the UFO investigator, and that they could not use the title without consequences. So, Steven sent the script to Hynek and had a meeting with the man he admired very much. He asked if Hynek could be the technical advisor to the film and consult. Hynek agreed, and to make sure there were no further issues, Columbia then bought the rights to his book, The UFO Experience, for $10,000. To make the film even more respectable, Steven wanted to get help from the Air Force and NASA, but they declined to cooperate. Instead, NASA sent a 20-page letter to Spielberg stating that the film was dangerous. This only emboldened Steven. I really found my faith when I heard that the government was opposed to the film. If NASA took the time to write me a 20-page letter, then I knew there must be something happening. Terry Garr was the first choice for Steven as Ronnie Neary. One day he saw a commercial and thought she was amazing because in 30 seconds she made a unique character in a coffee commercial.
Some of my friends don't really know the difference. I mean, to them, coffee is just something to drink. But I like coffee. I mean, I really get disappointed if it doesn't taste good. So I have to use MJP. Because somehow it always tastes good when it should. And I'm not the greatest cook in the world.
Terry was very excited to work with the maker of Jaws and lobbied for the part of Jillian for a short time, but Steven wanted her to play the housewife because that was his impetus for selecting her. She studied for the part by moving in with her sister-in-law and followed her around for a few weeks to get the gist of being a wife and mother. Francois Truffaut was picked by Steven because he loved the director so much. Although Steven bet the director would not be interested in being in his film, he felt compelled to at least try. He reached out to Truffaut and his agent, who could translate over the phone, and asked the director if he could send him the script and at least consider playing Claude Lacombe. Truffaut was very honored by the gesture and liked Duel and Jaws very much. A special script in French was made for Truffaut, and by March 15th, Truffaut responded, "I like the script and I like Lacombe." Truffaut was very busy though, as he was scheduled to shoot his new film, The Man Who Loved Women, in the fall. The bottom line was that if Truffaut's scenes were not finished by mid-August 1976, he would have to leave the project, so there was no margin for error. He also warned that he spoke almost no English, but Steven had an answer for that: the character of David Laughlin, who would serve as an interpreter for him as well on the set. Enter Bob Balaban, who was a friend of Dreyfus's, and he came to the casting call on March 24th, 1976.
So they said, "How's your French?" And I said, "Well, il y avait beaucoup d'années depuis que j'ai parlé français. Si vous me donnez ce boulot, ce sera très difficile pour moi." But nobody in the room spoke French, so they assumed I spoke fluent French and said, "Great, you have the job."
Now that he got the job, he had to do a crash course in French so he could get back on the horse to speak fluently again. During negotiations for Balaban's contract, Bob felt uneasy taking a part for 20 weeks without seeing a script due to secrecy. To calm his nerves, he gave Richard Dreyfuss a phone call and asked him if he should really go forward and sign for the part, to which Dreyfuss would say, "Stop being an idiot." After the phone call, Balaban held his breath for a bit, and on March 27th at 2 a.m., Richard Dreyfuss called Balaban back and told him that his agent was pushing for too much money from the studio, and it needed to stop or he'd lose the part. Dreyfuss told him that the budget is $11 million, but most of that money was for effects. A few days passed, and on April 5th they spoke again. Dreyfuss told him that Columbia was going to choose someone else because they can't afford him. On April 8th, Balaban signed for the film. Whether they lowered their rates to snag the part based on the phone calls, I cannot confirm. Upon taking the part, Balaban was told to keep his beard and glasses, while Dreyfuss would shave and lose his glasses, so that both actors would not get confused in the movie. The problem was, Dreyfuss couldn't see without his glasses very well. For the aliens, young children were cast and paid $25 a day, from the ages of 6 to 7 years old. The girls were from a Mobile ballet school, and their teacher, Susan Helfand, was hired to choreograph their movements. A few boys were used, but they were mainly utilized for wearing the heavy head masks that had articulation. During this period, there was some script polishes done, not only from David Giler, who would later be a nightmare for the Alien franchise, but from two of Steven's old friends, Hal Barwood and Matthew Robbins. The changes of the script changed the main character's name, gave the unit chasing UFOs the title Mayflower Project, moved the air traffic control towards the start of the film, focused more on Roy's obsession with Devil's Tower, including the shaving cream scene, and added a scene where Roy tears up his yard to get parts to build his Devil's Tower model. The addition of a new character who was a strange old farmer who would later make fools of everyone in the meeting talking about Bigfoot was introduced as well. Steven's buds, Hal and Matthew, also suggested that the boy Barry actually be abducted by the aliens, thus expanding Gillian's motivation and character further. During this period, on March 29, 1976, Spielberg attended the 48th Academy Award and was pretty floored that Jaws did not win Best Picture, but he moved on. One of the winners was Verna Fields, and in one of her interviews later, Verna implied that she saved Jaws in the editing room, which made Spielberg look like the production was a mess. During the first week of May, she was off the project, and many speculated it was because of her implications. Despite this, Spielberg replaced her with Michael Kahn. With everything in place, Francois Truffaut would fly to California on May 5th, 1976, and reported to Wardrobe with a salary of $75,000. When he met up with Spielberg, neither spoke their language very well, and Steven recalled their friendly but awkward time together. "Mostly, I stood around smiling stupidly. He returned the smile. We smiled at each other for about an hour." The part of Gillian was the last role cast for the film. Steven exhausted over 400 other actresses for the part, including a new drama school graduate from Yale named Meryl Streep. Steven even considered his new girlfriend, Amy Irving. Steven waited for lightning to strike with one of the hopefuls, but those he offered the part turned it down. And that was a few only. The rest just didn't have what he was looking for. Finally, with just 4 days to go till filming started, Steven thought about moving around all of Gillian's billion scenes until he got the right person for the job. It was then that Steven got a call from director Hal Ashby, who was busy in post-editing Bound for Glory. He suggested Steven check out one of his actresses, Melinda Dillon. Ashby cut some scenes of Melinda for Spielberg to inspect, and he was interested. Problem was, Dillon didn't want to do sci-fi movies, but after she read the script, she accepted Steven's offer. Finally, the film was ready on Sunday, May 16, 1976. The 114-member crew of Close Encounters flew from California to South Dakota. From there, they were driven 2 hours by bus to a Super 8 motel where they would stay in Gillette, Wyoming. On Monday morning, May 17, 1976, filming began for All Devil Tower location scenes. The first scene filmed was Richard Dreyfuss driving against traffic to enter the area. A few days before filming ended in this location, producer-chief Stanley Jaffe from Columbia Pictures showed how short-sighted and power-drunk he was when he disrupted the entire film for 4 hours. Jaffe read the script with the scenes written by Hal Barwood and Matthew Robbins, and was turned off by Barry being kidnapped. He approached Julia Phillips and believed it would turn away the audience. What the hell is this? This is not the movie I bought. Stanley demanded the abduction be stricken from the film, but Julia and Steven refused. After arguing for a bit, Stanley egotistically canceled the movie. Julia knew just how to handle this bozo and suggested they film 2 scenes, one where Barry is taken and the other where his mother pulled him back, thus preventing the abduction. Of course, Julia and Steven were going to keep the abduction scene, but it appeared that they were satiating Stanley Jaffe, so he reversed his decision 4 hours later. Steven would never film an alternate version of the abduction and stuck to his guns. When the crew got to Mobile, Alabama, it was hot and humid, and it was their home for 3 months. Steven had the best of it as he stayed at a rented house with Rick Fields and his editor Michael Kahn, who cut the film as they went. The Neary home was located at 1613 Carlisle Drive East, and production designer Joe Alves suggested the studio just buy the home, and then, when the shoot was done, resell it. The studio thought they were stupid and told Alves to just rent it. So, Joe Alves and production manager Clark Palo decided to buy the house themselves and make an easy profit by not only getting rent money, but then selling it after the shoot was done. When they told the executives that they would buy the house that they refused to purchase, the studio changed their mind and jumped the gun, buying the house for $35,000. After the shoot was finished, the home was sold for $50,000. The big set used for Alien Contact was the biggest indoor set used at that time. It cost $700,000 to make. The only problem with the set was that it was 120 degrees Fahrenheit inside, and if you were working in one of the cubicles, it was 140 degrees. Folks passed out, and as a result, many extras would quit, be replaced, and then they would quit. Yet spirits were high because those behind the film were enthusiastic about what they were making, and even Richard Dreyfuss would try to lift morale on the set by bringing cases of ice cream bars for all to share on the set. Despite this, the enemy of this film was seemingly the studio heads responsible for it. Due to the unique lighting of the UFOs, fog had to be utilized to capture the simulated moments, and when they used it, many in the crew got eye irritations, sinus issues, and it was hard to breathe. Steven referred to this set as this film's shark, which referred to the 1975 Jaws film, and if you don't know what I'm talking about, go watch those vids, as the shark was a nightmare in itself. Due to the details and logistics of these lighting scenes, the production schedule slowed down a bit, and when the bigwigs from Columbia showed up again, they made a stink, because for every day of additional shooting, it would cost $50,000, and they demanded reasons why scenes were slowing or falling behind. Julia Phillips put the blame on Vilmos Zsigman. Zygmunt was best known before Close Encounters of the Third Kind for McCabe and Miss Miller, Images, and Deliverance. It was put forth that he was slow in the lighting and overly detailed, and perhaps out of his depth. A person who didn't want to be named on the set, but was quoted in Close Encounters of the Third Kind, the making of Steven Spielberg's classic, stated, "They blamed Vilmos because he had never lit a set like this before, but nobody had ever lit a set like this before. There had never been a set like this before." Others on the crew attested that Zygmunt was out of his depth, but not Steven Spielberg. He was told to fire Vilmos, but he refused. He was pressured harder, but Steven stood up for his cinematographer, and eventually the studio let the issue lie. However, execs and Julia would constantly nitpick Zygmunt for the rest of principal photography, and he really felt betrayed by the studio and Julia. A perfect example of their micromanagement is when the alien ship opened up. Vilmos overexposed the aliens to hide their costumes and features. The lab printed one of the scenes too brightly, and it looked like there was nothing on the film. Julia was outraged that Vilmos ruined a day of filming, and after realizing the lab's error, he told Julia to go back and tell the lab to print the film darker. She did so, and the film was perfect, as Vilmos planned. Despite the treatment he got, he persevered, and as a result, he won an Academy Award for cinematography for Close Encounters of the Third Kind, making those who doubted him look like morons. No doubt, they appreciated his work after the film was released. The producers from Columbia were nuisances not only to Zygmunt, but production designer Joe Alves as well. When he was building his Crescendo set in Mobile, Alabama, the producers were frustrated that it cost $250,000. They said it should be built for $75,000. To which Joe replied, "Well, you don't understand. That's the square footage. It costs so much a square foot to build a set. So if you don't want that," and I did a very dramatic thing. I took a piece of sheet metal and I cut the model to pieces until it was this little thing, and I said, "There, that's $75,000. Is that what you want?" And they said, "Oh, no, that's okay. All right, build the thing. You sort of had to do this sometimes." Unfortunately, it didn't stop there, and Julia Phillips was starting to lose control of her composure. Julia would often lose her temper and blast away at those around her bluntly. One time, she started screaming at Joe Alves for an extended period of time about the lighting on the big set. When he told her he had nothing to do with the lighting, he just builds the sets, she got even more hostile and raised her voice further. Often, members of the crew would speak to Spielberg about her emotional tantrums, and it was pressure he didn't need. He had enough. Crew would speak of her acting high as a kite one moment and then sobbing uncontrollably the next. Many thought she was having a nervous breakdown, possibly due to her recent divorce, but those close to her knew she had an addictive personality. Steven was very much against substance abuse, and he didn't even drink. He was no stranger to Julia's parties and social gatherings, and furthermore, Goldie Hawn was also a friend to Julia back then, and Goldie was always trying to encourage Julia to stop using cocaine whenever she saw her. Steven knew all of this because he worked closely with Goldie in Sugarland Express and had a friendship outside of the film with both women. As Julia's erratic behavior grew, those that were not satisfied with the situation involving her complained to whoever they could, and soon, rumors were growing and starting to spread throughout Hollywood that Julia was losing it and had drug problems. One of Julia's biggest critics was Francois Truffaut because he was very friendly with Vilmos Zygmunt and was outraged the way Julia would often go after him. In fact, Francois felt that the majority of the delays and problems for the film was due to her destroying morale, being disorganized, and unprepared. Francois did his best to keep his mouth shut, but it wouldn't last forever. Now that some scenes were falling behind, the studio kept panicking, and after the executive visit involving Zygmunt, they deduced that the film would cost $15 million. With gritted teeth, they approved the new budget, but now assigned a studio bigwig, John Veitch, to remain on set overseeing all expenditures and eyeing everything from now on. Luckily, Veitch was not like like most of the studio executives in that he was fair, open, and encouraging to Steven's needs, and more often than not, John would back requested expenditures because he saw it helped and served the film. During breaks, the crew did various things. Steven and Dreyfuss would continue their tradition of playing video games. This time, it was Tank and Gunfighter. Sometimes they continued playing Pong, but Dreyfuss always won. Sometimes friends and family would visit, including George Lucas, who just finished shooting Star Wars. Another of Steven's visitors, besides his girlfriend Amy Irving, was Robert Zemeckis and Bob Gale, who are currently working with Steven on a script for 1941. Someday, YouTube, someday. I'm going to cover that one. I simply love that movie. For Terry Garr's free time, she and Francois Truffaut romanced each other. When time would allow, Joe Alves took trips to Florida to do location scouting for Jaws 2, as he was going to be the production designer, associate producer, and second unit director for that film. And for those that don't remember, Richard Dreyfuss was always verbal on his viewpoints politically, even in 1976. When the Ku Klux Klan did a march in Mobile for 4th of July, Dreyfuss stated publicly that he had a right to protest their existence. Within a day of the comment, he was receiving death threats, and 2 bodyguards were assigned to protect him. Balaban looked a lot like Dreyfuss, and because of that, he was worried and asked if he could have a bodyguard himself. He was told the budget of the film could not cover that request. So, instead of staying, Balaban went home during the 4th of July holiday to avoid everything altogether. On August 17, 1976, the crew celebrated Balaban's birthday and the end of production in Mobile, Alabama. While most of the crew left, some remained behind to dismantle the big sets and return things to the way they were. Thanks to the production being 2 weeks behind schedule, the production could not go to India as initially planned. Everything had to be postponed because Truffaut's new film, Small Change, was opening soon, and he had a schedule to keep as well as a director himself. As a result, this meant the release of the film had to be pushed back from Easter to the summer of 1977 as well. During the downtime, editing and special effects was the focus. A few extra shots were done as well. Steven rethought the aliens after seeing the remake of King Kong and wanted to film the aliens like that instead. This added another $100,000 to the budget. On October 1st, 1976, Truffaut's film Small Change opened in New York, and with it came interviews. During an interview with the New York Times, the rumors of troubles on the set of Close Encounters of the Third Kind came up, and Truffaut, not wanting to mince words, let the cat out of the bag and singled out Julia Phillips as the cause of all the film problems. She is incompetent, unprofessional. You can write that. She knows I feel this way. Once again, Steven was thrust in the middle when Julia and the studio requested that he make a response to that statement. He stated that Truffaut's comments were rather unkind, and then he stated, "Knowing him as I do, it is hard for me to believe that he said these things. I have never had such constructive and consistent support from a producer as I have had from Julia Phillips, and I know that Columbia Pictures concurs." Julia was not happy with Steven's response. Steven's reply was published in November in the New York Times, but it didn't matter. A few weeks later, Julia was pulled over for driving suspiciously. When 2 policemen approached her, they smelled marijuana in the car and they searched it. They found a vial of cocaine and arrested her for driving under the influence and drug possession. Of course, she got off with technicalities, but it was all over the press, and the news even aired it on Good Morning America, giving both the production and the studio another black eye. When December came around, more bad news occurred when a stunt driver almost died on the set during the scene where the police car flies off the road. The irony of this was the new cinematographer was partially the reason. Vilmos Zsigmond thought he was returning after Mobile, and Steven even stated that he was his man, but Vilmos was quietly replaced for some of the reshoots, and this was one of them. Although Vilmos felt terribly betrayed, he came out looking great, not only with his Academy Award, but because he was nowhere near the mess that caused the accident. The accident was all over the press, and the driver had a concussion, damaged his back and legs, and crushed his heel. The footage of the accident remained in the film. Basically, the cause of the entire accident was miscommunication. The driver drove too fast, and the ramp for the car to shoot off the edge was too high. Finally, on February 22nd, the crew went to India, where they would film the village who encountered the UFOs. Julia Phillips and Francois Truffaut stayed far away from each other. The shoot in India ended on February 26, 1977. In May 1977, the Flight 19 scenes were filmed, and Truffaut and Balaban were back together, this time without Julia Phillips, who was now becoming a nuisance to the production, and Spielberg had no patience for her anymore. Steven asked her ex-husband, Michael Phillips, to supervise the crew for the rest of the production, while Julia would continue working with the studio. The problem was, she had little allies, because she was constantly ignoring her duties and responsibilities. Many times, she would not show up for studio meetings and was never on time. When May 25, 1977 occurred, Star Wars released, and Steven took a vacation with his friend George Lucas to Hawaii, and it was then that the two began first talking about Raiders of the Lost Ark. Once again, Close Encounters premiere was changed. Now it was no longer coming out in summer, it was supposed to come out in the fall. However, as the summer of 1977 was coming to an end, Julia Phillips' credibility would now go down more with Columbia Studios. Her earlier attempt to mislead the studio about Douglas Trumbull's estimate for special effects was now ready to be paid up. Although she gave him $1 million at the start of the job, she now needed to pay up the other $2 million that she never told the studio about in an attempt to mislead the studio itself. Julia had to come clean, and the studio was very angry at her deception. Although the studio was really liking the film, they had no idea they had this expense, and it really put the studio on the ropes. With no choice, the studio paid this bill. By September 1977, the studio would fire Julia Phillips from the production completely. Her drug use was now becoming visible to everyone, and during one meeting, she actually brought cocaine and put it on the table in front of the executives. She was also very volatile and would argue with executives and even Steven Spielberg. She tried wrestling for more control over the film in a desperate power grab, but on September 13th, 1977, she was banned from the Burbank Studios lot, and she would fall into deeper drug addictions. In her autobiography, You'll Never Eat Lunch in This Town Again, she admitted to wasting over $100,000 on her drug habits. In the book and later interviews, she would go further by revealing secrets about everyone she knew in Hollywood, according to her, whether friend or foe, including Steven Spielberg, and even her old friend Goldie Hawn, who she described as a girl with dirty hair.
You said these people are your friends, and yet it seems from what Phil said, you talk about them and you're so down on them. How can they be your friends if you talk about them?
Well, ex-friends.
Not to be outdone, David Begelman, who was Julia's ex-boss, was discovered to be embezzling money from the studio in the tune of $60,000. It was actor Cliff Robertson that begun the investigation that toppled Begelman. Begelman used to be the talent agent in charge of Cliff Robertson, and he had the studio write him a check for $10,000. The IRS contacted Robertson about this $10,000 check that he never saw. Turned out that Begelman forged Cliff Robertson's signature and took the money for himself. It was discovered that he had done this with several other people. Begelman got a slap on the wrist, and surprisingly, Columbia did not fire him when they discovered his actions. Rather, he took a leave of absence and would return to the studio as an exec, but no longer the head of the studio. However, as news leaked of his actions, the loyalists on the board who liked Begelman suddenly became less protective of him, and more lawsuits and investigations were filed until Begelman resigned in February 5th, 1978. In the end, Close Encounters had a $19.4 million budget, but when the execs saw the finished film, they loved it and would go on to promote the film to the tune of $7.5 million merchandising budget. Columbia was slowly growing back to financial security with the success of Taxi Driver, Shampoo, and The Wind and the Lion. And if Close Encounters was a hit, Columbia would be back in the financial saddle. Though Steven was uncertain the film would make a ton of money, the studio was more optimistic than he was, and on November 16th, 1977, it was released, and we will cover that in our next video, where we will explore the movie itself and some more hidden meanings in the film.
What are you doing?
This means something. This is important.
I also wanted to take a short moment to point out some great material that helped us make this video. Beyond the many documentaries out there about this film, I highly suggest checking out Ray Morton's Close Encounters of the Third Kind, the making of Steven Spielberg's classic film. We will also be using information from Bob Balaban's Close Encounters of the Third Kind diary, and of course the Steven Spielberg authored film novel. We used all of these for researching our Close Encounters videos, and they are great reads. If you like what you see here, click like and subscribe. Use super thanks. It helps.